Welcome, everybody. We are very excited. The Farm Pond Advisory Committee and the town of Sherborn is very excited to have Hillary here talking to us tonight. She is the consultant who the town of Sherborn has hired to prepare a watershed-based plan for us and Farm Pond. And I don't think that we need to do many more introductions than that. I think she's got a nice presentation for us planned and then time to ask questions.
So I'm going to have to share my screen. Is that enabled currently? I'm about to try. Okay. Screen 2.
You should, yeah, you're fine.
Okay. So can everybody see my screen?
You're
Yes.
good.
Yes.
I can see
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you for having me. My name is Hillary Kenyon, and I am a limnologist or a lake scientist and a watershed planner and certified lake manager through the North American Lake Management Society. I also have a background in plant and soil sciences, and my firm, Applied Watershed Sciences, has been selected to work with you guys over the next couple of years to develop both a watershed-based plan and also an update and of lake nutrients and assess why you guys are having those cyanobacteria blooms and what to do about it. So thank you. And I think I'm going to have a long Q&A session at the end when you guys want to ask me questions. But if you want to type it in, if you know how to use Zoom, you should be able to type it into the chat. And if I monitor it while I'm speaking, I can try to answer some of those questions if they're applicable as I go along. Some of them I will end up saving towards the end, but just so people don't forget questions, try to type it in there and then we can keep a record and go through it at the end as well. Okay, so before I start, I just wanted to include a little bit about myself. I have an undergraduate degree in environmental science from UConn, and I did my master's research on lake sediments and septic systems at UMass Amherst. And over the past 10 plus years, I've worked on close to 100 lakes throughout the Northeast, primarily in the southern New England area and New York. But I've also worked on projects as far north as the Adirondacks, which have some really awesome up to 5,000 acre lakes that I've had the opportunity to work with. I'm very thankful. And my company and myself, we're based out of the Eastern Connecticut region. And I like to describe my services as being able to provide truly objective scientific evaluation of lake condition. And what that really means is that there's a lot of consultants and or lake management contractors out there that will try to sell you guys things to quote unquote improve water quality or to improve the lake. And I don't have any financial affiliation with those, so I think it's important to state that up front and let you guys know that any recommendations that I make are going to be truly tailored to your community and that I really care and want to walk with you guys through implementing those recommendations into the future. Some of my career favorites are cyanobacteria and also phosphorus mobility in soils and sediments. And I'm also a new mother, so you might hear my son crying in the background, possibly. He's trying to go to sleep right now. And this is kind of a terrible picture of him, but I thought it was funny because when I take him on the little walks, he's not quite as enthusiastic about water quality yet, but we have time. And so with that, I'm going to start pretty basic that we all live in a watershed. You've probably heard that term before, but if you don't know what a watershed is, essentially it is describing the area of land that is uphill of any given body of water. So the uphill area around Farm Pond is denoted by what we call a watershed boundary. And this is based on the topographic maps from the United States Geological Survey, or the USGS, and also based on that's existing data. So this is computer generated, and eventually we're going to have to go into the field and verify the edges of all of these places, because in certain circumstances, roads can extend or make the watershed smaller, and sometimes wetlands will flow in weird directions because of groundwater. So this is all going to be part of the watershed-based plan. But essentially, if you think like a raindrop, any water that falls on the upslope area is either going to run off directly to the lake or run off into a small pond or a small stream, and then eventually infiltrate into shallow groundwater and make its way through gravity to farm pond. And what is the importance of watershed management? Well, Farm Pond is also part of a much larger watershed of the Charles River that empties out into Boston Harbor. And watershed management at its core means to strategically use best practices in the way that we use the land every day. So if we all live in the Farm Pond watershed, or I don't, but you guys do, you want to make sure that the things that you're doing on your property or on the town properties is not going to be detrimental to water quality long term. And watershed management at its core is a community thing. So this is very important. Lake management, on the other hand, which goes hand in hand with watershed management, aims to tackle the problems that are going on in the lake already. And I'll explain some of that in the future. But basically, you want to identify what your primary lake uses are. And for Farm Pond, primarily, you want clear water. You want to be able to swim. You don't want cyanobacteria blooms. You don't want E. coli blooms. And secondary uses like sailing, rowing, fishing, and inherent ecological and aesthetic values as well. Combined, both of these things are essential for long-term success. And I emphasize over and over again that this is a sort of repetitive process where the monitoring of water quality is absolutely essential for making short-term and long-term decisions. And using that data is how you're going to assess whether or not what you're doing and what recommendations you've implemented are actually succeeding and making progress down the road. And to start, I just wanted to bring up the concept of lake aging. So if you've ever heard of the term of eutrophication, it, in a nutshell, describes the process of nutrient enrichment, where nutrients are primarily the elements nitrogen and phosphorus that comes from the watershed and eventually makes its way into the lake itself. The process of eutrophication means that over time, the lake is going to start growing more plants and algae. In a natural scenario where you have these lakes that have been formed by the last glaciation in New England, you start with an oligotrophic condition. And this is just a term to describe generally clear water bodies, which have fully oxygenated water columns and very, very little amounts. Can you see my cursor here, actually? Very small amounts of accumulated muck on the lake bottom and very few aquatic plants in the shoreline area. Naturally, the process of nutrient enrichment or eutrophication takes thousands to hundreds of years to get to change into the what we call mesotrophic or eutrophic conditions. Eutrophic conditions being the end state where you're dominated by lots of plants and lots of algae in the water column, which is essentially what we don't want. A lot of lake management is trying to take lakes that are in this eutrophic category and then push them back, which is harder to do than preserving water quality in the first place. And the point of this slide is that naturally this process takes hundreds to thousands of years, but unfortunately humans are really good at taking nutrients and moving them in places that they wouldn't normally be via consuming things and then having our nutrients out through our septic systems, using roads in the watershed that then don't have the natural ability to filter through the soil if the water is going to run off, doing construction processes. There's naturally a lot of the nutrient phosphorus in soils, and when the soil from a construction project ends up in the lake, it can potentially be used by algae. So overall, we want to make sure that what we're doing in a watershed isn't trying to accelerate that process and to slow it down over time. One of the most easily noted impacts of that type of eutrophication is the clarity of the water itself. So the Farm Pond Advisory Committee has been monitoring water clarity or Secchi disk transparency using the simplest form of measurements or limnological measurements, the Secchi disk and a viewscope. It is a measure of how far you can see into the water column and is an indirect measure of how much turbidity which is usually linked to the amount of phytoplankton or little tiny microscopic algae floating in the water column. Generally, like I said, clear water considered oligotrophic, moderately clear water is mesotrophic, and then the hyper or eutrophic conditions is when you get to the point where you have so many nutrients in the water column, you have the ability to grow a plethora of phytoplankton, and you oftentimes become dominated by cyanobacteria, which I'll talk about in just a minute. I introduced the concept of a trophic state simply because you're probably going to see this word passed around a lot, either through the written report itself or through the Mass DEP or EPA structure of doing watershed-based plans. But at the simplest term, it is a oversimplified classification that really just helps lake scientists communicate these complicated intricacies of nutrient dynamics and their impacts on the algae biomass, or chlorophyll A, and SECI, transparency or clarity. So in general, those clear water lakes have very, very low nutrients, very low phosphorus on this side, on the left side of the scale here. Oops, sorry. And then that corresponds to similarly low chlorophyll A and very good water transparency, water clarity. And as you start to get higher amounts of phosphorus in the water column, your transparency is going to decrease as a result of increasing phytoplankton and increasing chlorophyll A in the water column. And chlorophyll A, I should say, is just a general algae pigment that is produced and is one of the more standard things that managers will monitor over time. So again, why are these nutrients important? Because to go from this clear water lake to the less than 1 meter of clarity and dominated by cyanobacteria is such a tiny, tiny amount of phosphorus. It's really difficult to actually imagine how tiny that amount is. It's we're talking about parts per billion here, so or micrograms per liter. Generally, when you have less than 10 micrograms per liter or parts per billion of phosphorus in the water column, you're going to have fairly good overall clear water scenarios. As you start to creep up into the 10 to 30, it's going to start looking like this kind of water clarity. And then by the time you get to 30, you've actually pushed yourself over the edge to the point where it's really, really difficult to get back down to the mesotrophic or let alone the oligotrophic conditions. So right now, as part of this project, we're really trying to keep Farm Pond from getting to this point. I know that you guys have had some reduced summer clarity over the past few years as monitored by the volunteers. Unfortunately, in 2022, the volunteers did measure water clarity in certain circumstances that was less than 1 meter. And also, you guys have had some pretty decent cyanobacteria blooms. We want to figure out why those are happening and how to best control them. And get back to that historically excellent water clarity. So through that, we're going to be working on a watershed-based plan, which is part of the project here. Watershed-based plans are a very specific type of report that has been passed down from the federal government, from the Environmental Protection Agency to the state governments. And EPA requires these 9 minimum elements. And it's basically just a very, very standard structure to make sure that all of the plans that are going to be developed across Massachusetts and the country are doing so in a way that EPA can track it over time, and in a way that they believe to be most efficient for managing the watershed long term. In producing one of these watershed-based plans, it then opens up the community to funding, federal funding, through the Clean Water Act Section 319 grant program. Grant program. And that in itself can be used for making construction changes or implementing what we consider low impact development in the watershed itself. The model that's going to be used in the watershed-based plan is also very specific, but I think it's important to understand that this plan itself is also going to factor in all of the information that's been collected by the volunteers and any historically produced reports and modeling that has already happened, which is really important because I think ultimately you guys know you have certain problems, but in the past 3 years, the cyanobacteria has become more of a problem that we're more concerned over time now. I say here that non-point source pollution is primarily what these watershed-based plans are for. And that's different than point sources in that point sources are something like an industrial wastewater outfall or a wastewater treatment plant that would be more easily considered or more easily controlled over, or as opposed to non-point source pollution, which is extremely diffuse, and it's the real death by many cuts, many small pollution points that take way more time and oftentimes are more costly to control. And no, there has not ever been a watershed-based plan for Farm Pond. This is the first time that we're doing this. As I said, this watershed-based plan is going to incorporate all of the historical information, including the management plan that was produced in 2015. In 2015, you guys weren't seeing that serious decline in water clarity. So some of the information that was produced for this plan is no longer applicable because you have new problems that have been identified. The Farm Pond volunteers are going to have even more responsibility with their monitoring program throughout 2023 and 2024, and we're going to start soliciting volunteers towards the end of this as well. The Farm Pond Advisory Committee and the volunteers have been very active in working with the City of Worcester Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collaborative, and that is a part of the larger Region 1 EPA Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collaborative. And so what else does Farm Pond need in addition to this watershed-based plan? It needs an addendum specifically for cyanobacteria. Because the EPA structure of watershed-based plans is so specific, it doesn't leave that much room to talk about in-lake management and in-lake management options for controlling and managing cyanobacteria. So as an addendum to that, we're going to focus specifically on managing cyanobacteria potentially in lake management in addition to the watershed-based plan. And that will make more sense once I start talking about in lake management. But essentially that's why we're going to be looking for volunteers to take lots of photos and why you have new buoys out there collecting continuous data. I'm also, as part of this project, going to be doing a full lake aquatic plant survey, which you had one, I can't remember the year, of a high school student that did a pretty good job of the survey, but there has, to my knowledge, not been a professional aquatic plant survey yet. And because aquatic plants are interrelated to the process of eutrophication and are very important in terms of water quality and tracking change over time, this ties into that plan and this process. We also really need to ensure that there's no invasive species in the lake. I've done a decent amount of rowing around already, and I'm fairly hopeful that there's not, but surveying the aquatic plant community is really the only way that you're going to find and manage any new infestations of invasive plants. And this photo, unfortunately, is showing what I believe to be the 2020 Farm Pond cyanobacteria bloom. I wanted to talk briefly about cyanobacteria and potential toxins, just in case people don't have a background yet on this. I've thrown out that term quite a bit, but basically they are photosynthetic bacteria that float around in the water column that are able to use sunlight and nutrients in the water column to produce their own food. They are not technically algae, but they are often referred to and classified with blue-green algae. The other term that you're going to see a lot is HABs, or harmful algal blooms, and that's because of the toxins that they sometimes produce. I say potential because not all types of cyanobacteria produce toxins, and when they do produce toxins, it's highly variable and often difficult to monitor, unfortunately. I put up a timeline of awareness here for cyanotoxins because over the last 20-something years, the world and the state and federal government have come leaps and bounds and in getting better recommendations and guidance out there for managing public health concerns related to cyanobacteria. So in 1999 and to 2003, there was one publication out there with the World Health Organization, and then the CDC basically copied what the World Health Organization had put out. And at that point, it was just this document that existed that EPA didn't really reference that much, and the state governments had to essentially replicate what was there and come up with their own. But what we found in the 2000s to 2016 was that the state governments didn't have the same type of recommendations because there was no formal federal recommendation from the EPA about recreational water bodies. The World Health Organization initially and the Center for Disease Control initially focused on drinking water reservoirs, not recreational water bodies. So by 2019, the EPA put out a formal guidance for recreational waters, and that means for contact like swimming or water skiing or any other potential exposure pathway. And then in 2021, we finally had an update to the initial World Health Organization publication. So there's a lot of information out there, but this link here is to the Mass Department of Public Health website and their guidance for recreational beach closures related to cyanobacteria. They are extremely conservative. I say that cyanotoxin exposure can cause nausea, vomiting, skin irritation, itchy eyes, and potential even neurotoxicity and or liver failure in very severe exposure scenarios. This is mostly a concern for dogs that are going to be drinking the water or that would frequently swim in really gross cyanobacteria scums. Hopefully people are not swimming in the water that looks like that last photo here, because that does have the potential to have toxins that are harmful to human and pet health. Ultimately, if you see any sort of scum, the recommendations from Mass DPH are to post a cyanobacteria advisory. And then the town has then the power to decide whether or not they're going to allow people to swim at the public beach. In order to understand some of the information that's going to be in the watershed-based plan and some of the information that I'm going to present in a future presentation to you all, I'm hoping to be able to get all of us on the same page about basic lake science and basic limnology. So for those that are interested, there's specific evolutionary adaptations that cyanobacteria have that make it so even if watershed management is good, and even if watershed nutrient loading is low, sometimes there exist conditions in deep water lakes like Farm Pond that can favor cyanobacteria growth and provide them with nutrients from the deep waters. And the way that that happens is because in the fall and the spring, lakes are typically the same temperature from the top to the bottom. And we consider that two mixing events or dimictic conditions for temperate lakes in the Northeast. Tropical lakes are a whole different situation with temperature regimes. And temperature is really important because when it's the same from the top to the bottom, there's no density gradient, which means that the entire water column is going to be mixing and in constant contact with the atmosphere and the ability of oxygen to then diffuse into the water column and maintain oxygen over the sediment surface here. However, in summer conditions, when you start to have the warming of the surface waters or the epilimnion, that then causes the warmer and less dense water to start floating over the cooler and more dense bottom waters or the hypolimnetic water. The zone of rapid temperature change is the thermocline, aka the metalimnion, and that essentially serves as a density barrier which prevents that deep water from interacting with the overlying atmosphere. In turn, you have a reduction of oxygen at the lake bottom, which causes a series of chemical reactions in the sediment that are able to release nutrients that would otherwise have been stored in the lake sediments, but they, when in the presence of zero oxygen, can become released into the water column where cyanobacteria can take advantage of them. And so this process is referred to as internal loading and is going to be the primary updated nutrient assessment that's going to take place as an addendum to the watershed-based plan and how we're going to figure out what the cyanobacteria are responding to and how to best manage the in-lake internal load. I should also mention that nitrogen in the form of ammonia is also released in addition to phosphorus. So that's why we have those monitoring buoys that have been installed. There's 3 locations here. We have the open water area that has a big orange buoy that you guys have probably seen. And then the shallow water zones are monitoring temperature Those are shallow, and I didn't feel that they needed such a large buoy though. So those are pretty not very clearly visible unless you get up close. But if you're paddling around the shoreline, you'll probably see these. They have my information and contact information on there. If you do see them, please leave them in place. They're specifically set at depths so that we can collect high resolution information about Farm Pond. Temperature, dissolved oxygen, and conductivity are the types of data that these arrays are collecting. And ultimately, we're looking to decide if the cyanobacteria are responding to primarily open water, deep water events and nutrient loading, or if they're also responding to shallow water and weather events. When I come to a lake, or when I am introduced to a community that's having problems with cyanobacteria, I want to know what kind of bloom it is, because there are so many different types of cyanobacteria blooms. There are so many different types of cyanobacteria. I don't know if people have heard this from other types of outreach programs before, but they've been around for 4.5 billion years. We have a lot of evolution ahead of us to be able to manage these, and they've adapted to the environment almost perfectly, so that in certain circumstances, when presented the nutrients, they will almost always outcompete other types of algae in the water column. These pictures here show what different types of cyanobacteria blooms can look like. And unfortunately, some are easier to manage than others. So that's why it's going to be really important for volunteers to take photos whenever you see something on the shoreline. Even if you're not sure if it's a cyanobacteria bloom, even if it could just possibly be a green algae scum or a green algae bloom, take pictures and either upload them to the Cyanobacteria Bloom Watch app, which is through the Environmental Protection Agency. You can download this app on your smartphone, and it's pretty self-explanatory. And there are volunteers that are familiar with it on the Farm Pond Advisory Committee. Or if you feel like you're not very technologically inclined and you don't want to go through the process of doing all of that work and taking the multiple different types of photos and uploading the information, just take smartphone photos, and we are going to try to get together a Google file to retain the location data on the back of those photos. So when you take a smartphone photo, if you have your location settings in the shared, so your location settings are on, it should retain the longitude and latitude coordinates of where that photo was taken. And that's going to be really important for me to see where these blooms are showing up. Are they a full lake event? Is it always at the beach area? Is it more common on the northern side of the lake? These are all really important to figuring out how to best manage cyanobacteria blooms. The Bloom Watch itself is considered the level 1 type of cyanobacteria monitoring of the 3 types of levels that the EPA has. Farm Pond Advisory Committee volunteers are also engaged in both level 2 and level 3 monitoring through the Worcester Cyanobacteria Monitoring Collaborative. So if you're interested in getting involved in any of these levels, please reach out to this email address here, and Catherine will get in touch with you and get her in touch with me. And we're going to set up some Zoom meetings to talk about what I'm looking for, what's more important. And if you go on if you type in Bloom Watch in Google, you should also be able to come up with this website that is associated with the app itself. And it has the reports that have been over the last several years reported from both Farm Pond and all other lakes that are involved in the app itself. So it's pretty cool to see what blooms are happening, whether or not they were confirmed, and it retains the picture data as well. In addition to looking for photos and cyanobacteria monitoring, I'm also looking for volunteers that are interested in doing stormwater sampling. If you have a high school student or a college student, that's going to be perfect for them, because sometimes people don't want to run around in downpouring rain. So if there are high school students that are willing to do that, this is going to be a great opportunity for them. Once you do stormwater sampling, once you see stormwater runoff, you can't unsee it. I say to think like a raindrop, because before you go out, you want to figure out where those sampling sites are going to be most likely. Where is the water going to flow? You're looking at the potential route, And then in the middle of a downpouring event, you're looking for flowing water. Anywhere that has high turbidity usually is a nutrient source directly from phosphorus. So this is a photo I took of an active construction area in the watershed. And I understand that construction is going to happen. It's just a matter of trying to do it in a way that retains the soil, doesn't produce as much runoff, and to protect the nutrients from getting into the lake itself, because farm pond is extremely sensitive. And like I said earlier, the process of eutrophication is such a tiny amount of nutrients. There's a common number that's thrown out amongst lakes managers that says that 1 pound of phosphorus can grow 100 pounds of algae. And I would have to actually calculate to verify how accurate that is, but that's what why fertilizer use in the watershed is also such a problem. So if you're interested, get in touch again with the Farm Pond Advisory Committee, and we'll set up a Zoom meeting to talk about the stormwater sampling locations and the standard operating procedure that has been finalized with the Mass DEP to be able to use volunteer collected data. I also want to ask that certain locations, because there's a lot of private property in the watershed, we might want to sample on private property. So these might be locations where there's water coming to the property boundary. This might be a location on a private road or a private residence. We're going to be pinpointing some of these locations, and then hopefully, because you guys are a community, there will be ample time and access for the volunteers to take samples. The goal overall is to take stormwater samples during peak flow, which is usually towards the beginning of a storm in small watersheds like Farm Pond, and to take samples closest to the lake. Because if you take samples farther up in the watershed, it's not going to be 100% representative of what nutrients are actually making their way into the lake. We can talk more about that on the follow-up stormwater sampling volunteer meeting. Everything that I've talked about so far is going on in the 2023 phase 1 part of this project. 2024 will be phase 2 of the project, because it's important to be able to do this detailed assessment for cyanobacteria management and watershed management over the course of at least 2 seasons, because the weather highly impacts what happens with rainfall, what happens with runoff, and what also happens with cyanobacteria blooms. And so 2 years is going to give you, hopefully, an average of the conditions in both the watershed and the lake. And overall, the phase 2 in 2024 is going to focus on the full data analysis, preparing and presenting the watershed-based plan to Mass DEP. Mass DEP will then need to present it to EPA. And once it is accepted, that will then open up the funding for the Clean Water Act Section 319 grants for implementation of low impact development in the watershed. Cyanobacteria management addendum, I'm going to talk about that and give some preliminary recommendations based on what I see this year, but ultimately it's going to be a 2-year analysis. And hopefully we can get the lake to not look like this. These are blooms photos from, I believe, 2022 that was in the volunteer monitoring report from 2022. Hopefully we can maintain like the 6 meters plus of water clarity that Farm Pond has had traditionally. I guess with that, I'm going to ask if you guys have any questions. So thank you.
Hillary, I think there was one typed in from Marianne Moore, the criteria for deciding where you picked shallow water.
Okay, so yep, that's a good question. If I refer back to this slide, looking at the profile or the side view of a lake, this oxygen debt and the area that has no oxygen corresponds to a specific depth in Farm Pond. And so the depth where the shallow water temperature loggers were put is trying to pinpoint if this oxygen is, if this oxygen debt area is being affected by temperature in the shallow water. So I tried to get it basically at the bottom of the metalimnion, looking at if cyanobacteria are responding to shallow water blooms as soon as that depth becomes anoxic. Someone asked the question about lily pads. Yeah, I'm not surprised. So somebody said that they've noticed more lily pad growth in the last couple of years, and that's probably, I would definitely think that would be the case. Lily pads are going to spread over time. And in situations where you have very little accumulated sediment, they're going to spread really, really, really slow. In coves or shallow water areas where you have more sediment accumulated, which is again a precursor to eutrophic conditions or more plant growth, they can support denser aquatic plant communities. So that's one of the benefits of doing the full aquatic plant survey. You're going to get a baseline about what conditions are today. And then if you repeat that in 10 years down the road, the chances are you're probably going to see more frequent and more dense aquatic plants, unless we can get to the point where we are performing oligotrophication, which is moving the lake back into the clear water stage.
This is Marianne Moore speaking. I have another question,
Sure.
and this comes from the RFP that you submitted. You had mentioned sampling sediments, and that I believe is essential for estimating internal loading, at least according to the RFP. And are you still doing that? And where will those, or where have those sediment samples been collected in the lake?
So those sediment samples have been collected at 3 deep water locations, and they were done in April. I didn't include a slide about it, but yes, you are correct. Sediment sampling is absolutely essential to figuring out what your internal load is, because the nutrients migrate from the sediment into the overlying water column. And the reason that they were collected in April is because that is during the period of the spring mixing. So you have fully oxygenated conditions, which means that all of the nutrients should be retained in the sediments at that point in time.
So just one follow-up question on that. I'm wondering if sampling in the deep hole, you know, all 3 samples apparently came from the deep hole. Is that sufficient for determining the spatial extent of internal loading? In other words, could internal loading from the sediments be coming from areas outside of that deep hole?
Yes, internal loading does also happen from shallow sediments. It just, the shallow sediments tend to have less nutrients in them than the deep water sediments. So the deep water sediments are essentially the worst case scenario for internal loading. I actually, with my master's research, focused on trying to come up with a model estimating the gradient of phosphorus in lake sediments throughout a depth profile. And so what I found was that shallow sediments had considerably larger particle sizes and considerably less nutrients than deep water sediments, if that makes sense. So clays and very, very fine silts tend to have much more nutrients than the sand in the shallow water areas. So organic material has high nutrients, silts and clays have high nutrients, sand has very, very low nutrients.
Okay, thank you.
So somebody also asked a question about organic lawn fertilizers and if they're any safer. So unfortunately, no, they're not. Even though they're organic, it still is adding nutrients, but it really depends on what you're using them for. So the runoff of using a phosphorus fertilizer is more harmful than using like a compost in a raised bed scenario. Like, I understand that you live in the environment or you live in the watershed. I'm also a gardener. That fertilizers are used for growing vegetables. It's just that you want to make sure that you're not over applying. Personally, if I lived in the watershed of Farm Pond, would try to refrain from all fertilizers use, but I know that's unrealistic in certain circumstances. So just get your soils tested. And know that when you get your soils tested at UMass Amherst, they're going to tell you that you need such amount of phosphorus in your fertilizer, in your raised bed or in your garden, and they're probably going to overestimate that a little bit. So they're giving you the conditions that you need to grow really awesome gardens. Your garden's still going to grow if you have a little bit less nutrients in it. because there's already a lot of nutrients in the soil. So over application of any type of fertilizer is problematic, particularly of nitrogen, because it's very mobile in the soils. So phosphorus will run off, whereas nitrogen will seep into the groundwater and become a problem for a long time.
Hillary, someone asks the Burton family, is it safe to swim in the pond this year? That's not for you to have to answer. I don't think. I think that's always a changing answer. Right now, pond looks great. I mean, there's a bunch of things to think about in terms of safety in the swim area. There's always the E. coli testing that is mandated for swimming beaches. And that we've posted, the town has posted, and information's been communicated every time we've seen a hint of cyanobacteria, but it is safe right now. I don't know.
So if I can add to that,
Yeah.
The Massachusetts Department of Public Health guidelines are extremely conservative. It's unlikely that farm pond has cyanotoxins that are high enough to really hurt a human that's not swimming directly into the bloom itself. If you see a surface scum, don't swim in it. That's my recommendation. If you see water that looks really gross, don't swim in it. Don't let your dogs drink the water. An advisory on one side of the lake doesn't necessarily mean that the open water area is also harmful to human health, because cyanobacteria move from one side of the lake to another based on wind accumulation.
I know you know this. We did have the state come in and test our waters the end of September and end of October last year. They found negligible, nothing, like no evidence of toxins or cyanobacteria. And that was during a peak time of when we saw the water looking very green. I mean, again, you can have an algae bloom as well as cyanobacteria blooms. And I think
so I'll just add one more thing before I get to Michael, because he's had his hand up for a while. Okay. Cyanobacteria blooms are extremely patchy, and it's really frustrating as managers, because I've seen blooms where I've taken 5 different samples and have gotten a concentration range from nothing in a scum to 10 feet away, the concentration being like 10 times the public health limit. And so the variability is important. And I think in general, if it doesn't look like it's clear water, just don't swim there. If it's generally clear in the open water areas, even in the weeks that you have an advisory at the beach, make your own judgments. And Michael, you said you had a question?
Yeah, I was curious in this study, to what extent do you even, in terms of coming up with a management plan, to what extent do you need to sort out where the nutrients are coming from, the phosphorus and nutrient between, whether it's internal sources or some groundwater or septic systems or stormwater runoff? Yep. Do you actually need to discern all of that, or I don't know, to what extent do you try to figure out where things are coming from, because then that would make a difference as to what actions we could take?
Yes, I do, and we will be trying to determine where the nutrients are coming from. And oftentimes it's coming from everywhere, and you're looking at a percentage of nutrients coming from various sources. And what that percentage is good for is understanding what actions to take first, how much money to spend on certain types of actions, and whether or not you should see a visible improvement after those actions, if that makes sense.
All right, that makes a little sense. Can you actually discern, let's say, septic system issues from, is that something that'll be isolated somehow?
It is, yeah. So septic systems are notorious for leaching nutrients through the soils, particularly nitrogen. And so part of this project is also going to be looking at shallow groundwater seepage sampling, and also an update to the septic systems nutrient loading model that was done from 2015.
Okay, and the issue of fertilizer, which is always going to be tricky, as you said. So whether you can get people to stop doing that in the watershed, that's also going to be somewhat identifiable in all of this.
Sometimes it is. It depends on how widely it's used. I have seen in circumstances where there's either a failing septic system, or a very obviously over-fertilized garden. The algae growing around that property is going to be extremely obvious. And so that is one of the things I'm also going to be looking at when I do the full shoreline aquatic plant survey.
No, sounds all great and wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, Marianne. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a follow-up question regarding the groundwater sampling. I believe you're going to be taking shoreline groundwater samples. Is that true?
Yeah.
Is that the plan? And you mentioned that you're going to be analyzing for nitrogen. Will you also be looking at phosphorus in these samples?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, have you thought of using another indicator that's sometimes used for groundwater issues? I'm thinking of septic tanks. And that's caffeine and the human metabolites of caffeine. Would there be any value in using that?
I personally have never used caffeine as an indicator. I've used other indicators, sometimes boron, sometimes optical brighteners, sometimes conductivity. I've never used caffeine. I don't know of a lab that actually tests for it. So if you find one, it would be interesting to add that to the project if it's not too expensive.
Yeah, well, there is one in Nebraska, but that may not be necessary and it may be expensive. So would it be possible to use optical brighteners? And would that be useful?
Yes, but that also only means it's only present in small amounts if the septic system is failing. So there's a difference between a septic system that is considered failing in terms of the public health requirements for on-site wastewater, and a septic system that is just simply using or supplying nutrients. So in a lot of cases, the nutrients are going to be present, but the indicators of a failed septic system won't, if that makes sense.
No, I think it does.
Yeah, so like it's similar to a dye test. If you do a dye test for a septic system, you're only going to pick up the dye if it's a really bad failed septic system. A lot of people think that doing a dye test is how you determine if your septic system is working properly, but I'm saying it's not. It really only determines whether it's completely failed or not. A lot of septic systems are working suboptimally, and it's the nitrogen concentrations that are going to be able to tell you that, and sometimes conductivity.
Okay.
I think there's another couple questions on the chat. Let's see. So someone said, how do we think people will respond to the concept of changing landscape regimes for the potential of clearer water? This is a community question, I suppose. It's because you guys are so used to having very, very clear water. I think your community hopefully will be very receptive to using lower amounts of fertilizer in the landscape. Some water bodies have had algae blooms for a long time, and the people are using the lake for other purposes. Like I have one client group that they do have cyanobacteria blooms, but they're also exacerbating cyanobacteria blooms with using large wake boats and destroying the shoreline environment and causing resuspension. That's not something that Farm Pond is doing. So I hope that the community is more responsive to the steps that need to be taken to minimize cyanobacteria blooms and keep your water quality very good. Someone else asked a question about a shallow well being close to the edge of the pond for drinking water. Should they be concerned about contamination from cyanobacteria into your well? It's possible, for sure. Unfortunately, cyanobacteria could potentially migrate if your well is very, very close to the shoreline area, or if you have, I was in the field earlier with Tom, and there was a person whose well was actually set very low. So if the lake had flooded at any point, you'd actually get surface water covering the well. That could be a potential problem as well. In general, though, if you have a groundwater well that is more than 5 feet away from the shoreline and you don't have a very consistent cyanobacteria scum directly along that shoreline, the chances that the toxins are going to migrate into your well are much smaller. If it makes you feel better, you should be able to test your well water for cyanotoxins if you have a bloom present on your shore. Approximately what percentage of the lakes that I've looked at, hold on, where growth has continued to get worse versus improved? Are you talking about plant growth? Yeah, so the blooms and plant growth. So in most scenarios, watersheds are extremely overpopulated. Farm Pond is not in that category. I think you guys have very good land use practices already in place, and you don't have a very densely populated community in the watershed compared to a lot of more urban lakes that have a lot of problems with water quality. So a lot of the water bodies that I've worked on in the past, you're essentially trying to roll the ball uphill constantly because there's always development that's going on. There's always construction that's going on. And what we're doing is trying to keep the conditions the way that they are and prevent them from the ball from rolling downhill. I personally have been involved in certain circumstances where in-lake management has remediated the cyanobacteria problems. I think Farm Pond is a really good candidate for both combined in-lake and watershed-based management. And I do think that you can get to a scenario where you have much fewer cyanobacteria blooms, if at all, through in-lake and watershed management. I don't think it's the hopeless scenario of a lot of really highly developed watersheds. Will there be some focus on the street drains that end up in the pond? Yes, definitely. So that's one of the primary locations that would be sampled during the stormwater sampling events. And what type of beneficial native buffer plant material should we as lake butters consider planting to help mitigate harmful runoff? Great question. The most important thing to mitigate harmful runoff is to make sure that you have a buffer zone that is at least 3 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The buffer zone, obviously, if you have more plant growth and a wider buffer zone, it's going to have more roots and more plants to uptake any runoff that moves through it. But the 3 foot by 3 foot is pretty much my absolute minimum. And you want generally to have plants that are with a strong root base that don't need any fertilization, native plants preferably, and things that don't need to be maintained as much is always best.
Would that include, are there types of species that could be recommended where they have deeper root structures than others in terms of the kind of, and that's something we can learn about in terms of, I'm trying to think of how the 3 feet high goes if you're near the lake and there's groundwater going underneath that sort of berm-like structure that
well, so the roots also, if you're going to have any type of shrubbing, like shrubby plant material or small trees, those roots are going to be intercepting those nutrients as well, which is really important to a buffer zone.
Right. So grass is grass considered a very inferior buffer zone compared to what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any places where is there a legal basis for doing any kind of regulation, or it's just all private property and there's not, in terms of just fertilizer use and kind of buffer zones, is there any basis for doing more than just pure hoping the best?
So you might be referring to a townwide ordinance of some sort for the Farm Pond shoreline area. That would probably take place through the Conservation Commission. We can talk about that as incorporating it as a potential option for the watershed-based plan itself.
Okay. Sitting on the Conservation Commission, I guess it'll be interesting to talk about. What in-lake management recommendations are likely for preventing cyanobacteria blooms? There's a lot. I want to refrain from
talking about too many of them before I fully understand the dynamics of the cyanobacteria blooms at Farm Pond. But typically there's many different types of both circulation aeration and deep water oxygenation, or non-circulation aeration. There's various types of phosphorus binding treatments that can be used in both the water column and in the sediment area. And there's a number of different products that I'm not going to start speaking of yet, because it's important to understand why the blooms are happening before we start trying to solve them. All of that information will make its way into a future presentation, though, I promise. Daryl has his hand up.
Hi. So I was wondering if you've seen in any communities where, say, a list of reasonable products to use in the home, non-phosphate detergents and that sort of thing, or products for the lawn or whatever, have been provided to homeowners as a way for educational outreach with any success.
Yeah, so I've been involved in creating sort of tailored lists for communities before, but there's also general lists and products that are available through Mass DEP, the Watershed Planning Program. I do tend to be more critical of certain types of products than I think DEP generally is, though.
I'd be happy to go beyond just the DEP list and do something more progressive. Also, it might benefit the performance of septic systems as well, to not be using things that interrupt the biological processes that are trying to go on within the septic systems. And also, there are a lot of chemicals. They may not be the ones of concern here, though, that are not addressed by septic systems at all. So I don't know if
that is
factor.
true. In general, I'll say that your septic system, if it's properly designed and sited, doesn't need any kind of additives. So like those Drano products and septic system additives that a lot of times the pumper cleaner companies will sell to homeowners, those actually aren't needed for the most part.
And I assume you're aware that the soils around Farm Pond are very sandy. So unfortunately, things travel very fast. And also it doesn't offer the sorption surfaces that one would get with more complex soils or more organic content soils.
Yep.
So that might be
exactly
part of the
true.
problem.
Yeah, specifically nutrients, as they leach through the soils, sand, unfortunately, has, like you said, very small number of comparative sorption sites for those nutrients. And so it moves very fast through the sand, and it moves in higher concentrations through the sand and farther distances. I think, are there any more questions? Might be it. Thank you guys so much for having me. I really enjoyed speaking to you guys. Oh, hi, Sophie.
I had one last question. Hi, did we actually, at the end of last summer, when the pond lost clarity below a meter, was that actually cyanobacteria, or did we ever figure out what it was?
So Tom did take samples, and there was cyanobacteria in the water column. I don't know if all of the clarity was attributed to cyanobacteria, but at least some of it was.
Okay, so that big green. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can support that, what Hillary just said. And although it seemed like the relative amount, and we're just talking relative, the relative amount of cyanobacteria did not appear by the microscope to be as high as what you were literally seeing in the very unclear water. So my guess, and this is Hillary's job, my guess, it was a mixture of cyanobacteria and green algae.
Yeah, and so part of this project is also more frequently going to be monitoring the algae composition. So looking at what phytoplankton is in the water column on a monthly basis. And additional samples are taken by the volunteers.
Excuse me, Hillary, will you be looking at phytoplankton? Because Tom and I were quite convinced that the bloom last year was composed of very, very tiny cells, and that can be difficult to sample. I mean, you certainly can't collect them with a net.
No, so I collect integrated samples, not using a net. So any picocyanobacteria is going to go through the Cyanoscope monitoring kit nets. I believe those are only like 40 something microns. So you're only getting large colonies in those samples. I am doing strictly water sampling using an integrated tube. So I am going to get picocyanobacteria. If I feel that there's a disconnect between the cells per mil that I'm counting on my microscope, I will send out the samples to a better lab to look at the picocyanobacteria as well.
And you'll also be looking at phytoplankton. I'm thinking of green algae.
Oh yeah,
I'm
sure.
not cyanobacteria. Okay,
Yep.
That's great.
Yeah, when you get down to the like unicellular level, my microscope is good, but it's not great for doing that. I can see it, it's just very taxing on your eyes to count it. So that's where the redundant counting would come in. I believe you guys are also going to continue doing the fluorometry as well, which I'm really excited about. Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Looking forward to working more.
Thanks, Hillary.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
Thank
see you guys all soon. Take care.
Sounds wonderful.
Have a
Hillary.
nice night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.